Hello and welcome to this Getting Started guide for Rucksack. So the first thing we have to do is go to Edit, Project Settings, Player, and then make sure you're using the scripting runtime version .NET 4.6 and that the scripting or API compatibility level is set to .NET 4.6. This is required, you have to do this, so make sure that any assets or third-party assets that you use from other developers work with .NET 4.6. Okay, so once we've done that, we can go into our scene and we can start by creating a managers object. And the managers object basically contains all the managers that we need, which has references to our project that Rucksack will need to set everything up. So we can go to Tools, DevDoc, and then Setup Wizard. And this basically gives us a quick setup wizard and that helps set up the managers object. So we need all of these, so we can just click on the Fix button and it will automatically add it for us. So we can just fix it, hit scan. So basically this utility just scans your entire project and makes sure that everything is set up correctly. So right now we need to set up a database for our localization and we need to set up a general settings object. So I'm just going to click the generate default database to start with this one. Save everything in a separate folder, so don't save anything inside of the DevDoc folder, because if there's an update or you decide to remove the asset or whatever the reason is, you will lose your files, so just create a new folder and save everything in there. So I'm just gonna save it here, and it links everything, and as you can see the red warning error is gone. For the general settings manager, we can go into our demo folder, right click, go to create, DevDoc, general settings, and we can link that one. And that's everything we have to do for our managers. So if we click for scan again, no problems are found. So next up, we can create another object, and this one will be for UNet. So to set up the UNet system, we can add a manager, the network manager. So this handles all the networking code. You can use your own manager, but for the simplicity of this setup guide, we'll just use the built-in manager from Unity. So the only thing we really have to set is the player prefab we can do here. So let's create that one. First I'm going to add the network manager HUD so we can very quickly start a new server and try out our game. So let's create a new player prefab. Player prefab. And a camera. For the demo, we can use a simple camera movement, it comes in the package, so you can just use that to get started quickly. And for our player, we need to add a bunch of components. So we'll start off with the player component. We'll need the inventory player component. If you're making a single player game, use the inventory player component. If you're making a UNet game, use the UNet inventory player. As you can see, this adds a network identity. We also need a network transform. This will sync our movement over the network. So if the player moves, this will be replicated on other clients. We need the item collection creator. So in this script creates a new collection and we can check the is player collection. So it actually binds it to this specific player. We can give it a name, for example, inventory 1, and we can say this inventory has 10 slots and the player will get read and write permission when the collection is created. So we can revoke permissions on player collection. So for example, when the player goes into a dungeon, he only gets read permission to his inventory collection, or when he's in a cutscene, etc. But we'll start with read and write permission so the player can actually move items around and use them. And then we need to go into our item collections, type the name of the inventory collection. So as you can see here, we create a new collection with the name inventory 1 and 10 slots. And we get read and write permission, and then we need to bind this specific collection that we create here to a player. So we can type inventory 1 here. Each player will generate their own collection named inventory 1, and the server will manage this for us. We'll set up equipment collections and currency collections in a later video. Okay, so now we've set this up, I'm just going to drag the player object into our demo folder and create a new prefab out of it. Remove from the scene and assign it to our manager, to our player prefab. So let's create a floor panel, something to stand on. So in our DevDoc Rucksack prototyping, we have a bunch of prefabs that we can use to quickly get started with a basic level. So now that we have that and I start the game, it should instantiate the player and create a collection for it. We're not going to see anything yet because we don't have a UI, but it should show us everything in the logs. Okay, so we forgot to set up the UNet actions bridge, which is a component we need to add to our player prefab. This will bridge all of the network code between the player and all of the clients. So if we go here, we can set the UNet actions bridge. We need to link our player components. And we need to set up a currency database, item database, and equipment type database. These are all the values that the player needs to pick up items, to drop them, to equip them, etc. So let's create those now. So go to create and then rucksack, and then we'll create a item definition database. Create rucksack and a currencies database, and we also need the last one, the equipment type database. So we'll go back to our player prefab and we'll link all of these up. There we go. So we've got these linked now, and if I start the game now, it should start with the instantiated player and tell us in the console that new collection has been created and registered, inventory 1. The client has received permissions for this collection. The client has registered it, so this is actually happening on the server, as you can see here by the tag, and that's when it's replicated to the server. So in this case, we're running as a host for both the server and the client. Okay, so this works. Now let's create our first item. If we go to Tools, Rucksack, Main Editor, we can choose a database that is in our project. So in this case, we have the DevDoc demo new Unity item database, which we just created, but you can also select one or drag one into this manual selection box in case it doesn't show up here. But in this case, this is the database we just created, so we're just going to select that, and we can now create a new item. So from our new item, I'm going to create a simple standard Unity item definition object, and this is our main item editor. So in the item editor, you can define all the values of the item, but you can also create chains of items. So for example, you might want to create a sword that inherits from another sword. So to give you an example of that, imagine you create a sword which has a couple of components such as damage and defense and the amount of weight it has, and you would then want to make an item that derives from sword called fire sword. Now it inherits all of these values, but you might want to override the name, the description, and the damage it gives. The rest of the values it will still grab from sword, so you can chain them together without having to redefine the entire weapon over and over and over. This can be very useful because you don't have to redefine every item every single time again and again. You can simply inherit from these and create a chain of items. So for now, let's leave the parent object empty. We'll just create it in a minute. So we can create the name of the item. So let's call this sword. A simple sword for the description. We can give it an icon. So in our demo project, we already have a few icons that we can use. We can select a world model. We have a sword somewhere. There we go. And we get a quick preview. We can give it a layout shape. This is only useful for collection layouts where an item in a collection can take up more than a single slot, but we'll cover this in a future video. The maximum amount of stacks, so in this case our sword can only be 1 in a stack, and we'll give it a weight of say 2 kilos. We can give it a buy and a sell price. So for the buy and sell price, we're going to introduce vendors later, so for now I'm just going to leave it empty and we'll do that in a future video. So to demonstrate the chaining of items, to create the chain, I'll create a new item called Unity item definition, and we'll link this one to our previous item. And as you can see, it immediately inherits the values like the icon, the world model that we have here, and these all get grayed out, as you can see, because they get inherited. So there's a little icon here in the back, which is a little loop icon, which indicates that the value is inherited from the parent. So if we now change it, for example, the weight, you can see that it changes and it's no longer inherited from the parent object. If we make either the same or the default value, it will inherit from the parent. And you can see that here. Okay, so now that we have 2 items created, so let's go over the other editors as well. So we have the equipment editor here. So for our equipment editor, it's pretty straightforward. We can create a new equipment type. And an equipment type basically defines where a certain item can get equipped, but we'll go over this in more detail in the future video on item equipment. And then we have currencies, which are pretty self-explanatory. You can create a currency, for example, gold, and give it an icon, the amount of decimals that this currency can have, and the maximum amount of currency or gold that you can have of this type. We'll go over this in a future video as well. And as lastly, we have the settings, which is the general settings object we actually just created. But you don't really have to define anything here. You can set a default cursor when the game starts, but this is not really necessary. You can actually leave it blank if you'd like. Okay, so that's the editors. We have set up our player. So what we can do now is create a UI so we can actually see our collection. So we can actually use the default collection if we'd like, the default UI, but we can also create our own collection UI. So that's actually what I'm going to do right now. So I'm just going to go to UI and then to canvas. And we now have created a new canvas. We've got our event system, and in here we're going to create a new collection UI. So I'm just going to create an empty new object, call it inventory, and we'll give this an inventory, collection UI. So this automatically adds a window and the item collection UI component. So for now, the window, we're just going to call it inventory. This can be the same as the collection name. It doesn't have to be, but it's so you can find back the window later if in case you want to do that programmatically. If you don't, you can actually leave it the same. Okay, we need to add an input handler. So an input handler basically just allows us to press a button to show this window and to hide it again. So in this case, we'll use the letter I to open and show the window. Okay, next up in the item collection, we need to set a prefab, a UI container, and a collection name. So the collection name in this case is inventory1, the one we just created on our player prefab. So we got our player here, and we have our item collection creator component, and this one creates a collection with the collection name inventory1. And we want to display the collection inventory1 here in our UI. So make sure this name matches perfectly, otherwise the UI won't be repainted. So we need a collection slot UI base prefab, which is basically a single slot inside the collection that is going to show our items. So I'm just going to create a new one so we can do this completely from scratch. So we'll start with creating a new object inside of our inventory. And actually, before we do that, let's give our inventory an image background so we can kind of see what it would look like. So I'm just going to reduce the alpha on the image here, make it something like this. So we actually have a simple window. Okay, so this is going to become a slot. And we'll create a, let's see, item collection slot UI component. So this is the basic component that is going to display our item inside of the UI. So we have a reference field for the item name, description, the icon, the cooldown of the item, the stack size, and the stack size format, so the way the stack size value is displayed. So what we can do now is create UI elements, for example, a text field, which will be the name of the item. And not sure why, but it didn't create a rect transform on this object, so let's just do that directly. For the UI, you always need to use rect transforms. Okay, so I'm just going to set this one to the top. And set the Y pivot point to 1, so it will actually move it to the bottom. So you can see this is one small box, and we display the name here, and then we can also display an image, which will be the icon of the item that will be placed inside this slot. So let's call this one icon. Let's give it an example icon, some boots, and let's say we only want to display the name and the icon. We don't actually want to display the description. You can, if you want to, simply create another text field here, and then link them in the respected fields. So item name, we link the name field. For the icon, we link the icon image, the component that we have here, to the field that we have in our UI component. And let's actually add the stack size as well, because it's kind of useful to see how large our stack is. So I'm just going to duplicate the name, call this stack, and let's put it at the bottom. Of course, you can place it wherever you'd like, doesn't really matter, so long you actually link them to the slot UI component. So there we go. And I'm just going to grab this one and drag it into our folder to make a prefab out of it. Remove it from the scene and assign it here inside of our prefab field. Next up, we need to set the UI container, and this is where all of the slots that will be generated at runtime, the slots that are inside the collection, will be placed. So we want to place this inside of this inventory, so it will become a child of this object. And we can add a grid layout group so that all the items will actually be displayed nicely in a grid, so they'll look like a traditional inventory. And we can look at this if I just drag a few in. You can see this is kind of what the inventory is going to look like. Okay, so we now have a simple UI that is going to display or repaint and show the collection named inventory1 inside of this object. So let's see if it works. Just note that the UI window by default hides the window on start, so you always start with a clean slate. We can actually disable these so that it won't actually hide the window on start, so it will still be visible. So we start the game, start as a host, and it generated the slots here. So the collection is empty, there's no items in it, but as you can see, it actually generated these slots. And you can see in the runtime information here on the right that the slot is completely empty, so there's no items in it. So let's create an item in the world that we can pick up, and once we do, it should go into the inventory collection and repaint the UI. Let's go to our demo floor. So let's set up an object that we can click, and when we click it, we add an item to our inventory and the UI will repaint. So we can do that by creating a new object. For example, let's use a sphere as an example. And onto this, we'll add a UNet trigger, and a trigger is basically something you can click and it does anything. And in this case, we want it to pick up. So we'll say UNet item pick up, and we can choose the item we just created and the amount of items we want to pick up. And we also need to add an input handler, which is a trigger input handler, which basically allows us to click it. This handles the input and the clicking of the sphere itself. Lastly, what we need to do is create a range handler. And a range handler basically defines the range in which we can pick up this object. So if we set it to 8 or 10 or whichever, that is the range in which a player or character can pick up this object. So we have the sphere, we have the UNet item trigger, we have the item pickup, and the input handler, so that should be everything that we need. A few things that we want to check, just in case that we didn't miss them. On our player, we have everything set up. Our player needs to have a collider. So I added this one just a second ago. Our player needs to have a collider for the range handler to actually work. So in this case, I added a capsule collider and I added a rigid body and set it to kinematic. This is required for the range handler to work. Lastly, for the clicking, we need to make sure that we have a physics raycaster attached to our camera. With the event mask, ignore raycast has to be off, so make sure that either you can set it to everything, but just make sure that ignore raycasts is not checked, otherwise this is not going to work. So we have our object that we can pick up, and our player and camera are set up correctly. So now if we go back in, start as a host, click the object, and as you can see, it's immediately added to our collection. Now if we look in the console, we can actually see what's happened over the network. So this was when the UI was created, so it repainted all the slots. Let's see, created the collection, we set the collection permissions. So the client requested to use a trigger, which was the sphere that we clicked. We also immediately unused it because the object got destroyed in the process. The server sent us the object, the item that was on the sphere. So the server controls that, and then the UI got repainted. So the slot 0, which is the one you see here, got repainted with the sword. Now, as you may have noticed, you can't actually drag the item, or you can't click it, use it, you can't do anything with it. The UI doesn't do anything yet. And that is where input handlers come into play. So we can actually go into the slot that we previously created, And onto here we can add input handlers, and an input handler just handles some form of input on the slot. So it could be dragging, clicking to use it, right click to use it, or right click to sell it, whichever. And you can create different input handlers. So if we just search for input handler, you can see that we have a item collection, sell to vendor. We have a input handler, we have an item collection slots, item vendor, which have a trigger input handler. So I'm just going to add the item collection slot input handler. So when we right click it, we attempt to use it. We also have a sell to vendor. So when we right click it, we try to sell it to the vendor if a vendor window is open. We also have a drag handler, item collection slot drag handler. So drag button left. We can also, if we click it and then click on another object, we can actually cause it to essentially drag. So we click it once and then on a destination slot. I can actually show you. And the drag button we want to use. The way the input system works is that it works from top to bottom. So it will first try to use the item. So that's what this one does. Then it will try to sell the item, and then it will actually try to drag the item. So if we want to set the priority, for example, we want to try and sell it before we use it. If this action fails, it will jump onto the next one. So it goes from top to bottom. And it will consume the event if it actually succeeds in doing it. So make sure consume event is checked if you don't want it to propagate down the hierarchy. Okay, so we set up some input handlers. Let's give it a try. And we go in game, we click the sphere, and now we can actually drag the item to different places. But as you can see, it is actually not accepted on the other slot. So we can drag it, but we can't actually move it. And that is because the object we're dragging to, so I've selected the slot here, we drag onto another slot, but it can't actually be registered because Unity will only register, as you can see, raycast targets. So in this case, if we had an image, and the image can be completely transparent, but we need to have a raycast target so the drag object can actually be dragged to a certain target, otherwise it won't be registered. So now we should be able to drag the item around. So pick up the item, we can drag it around inside of our collection. That's it for this tutorial. In the next one we'll go over character equipment and how to set up loot boxes. So see you in the next video.